He's here. Drawdillon rushed through the corridors of the royal palace, her slippered feet pattering against the polished marble floors. Her favorite shawl trailed from her elbows like a pair of gossamer wings. Maids and footmen stepped aside and looked curiously after her passage. He's here. Her steps took her to the Western Annex and brought her in front of the Royal Archives doors. She paused for half a moment before placing her hand on the door's wooden surface and leaning into it. The scent of cedar and vellum flowed over her as her eyes roamed the interior. She could only see empty aisles between the rows of bookshelves, but she could feel him deep inside. Even from her bedroom, she could sense his coming. In the archive's central atrium, a tall man with long black hair stood in a brightly colored robe. A tome sat open atop his left hand. His chin rested atop the knuckle of his right index finger as his eyes scanned the lines of the page. Drawdillon's face broke out into a wide smile. Papa. She dashed forward, wrapping her arms around his leg and burying her face in the exquisite fabric of his garb. The man looked down at her from his reading, eyebrow raised. What are you doing, little wormling? Well, I suppose your great-grandmother did things like this, as well. You must be Drawdillon. Drawdillon looked up at the man and nodded energetically. He probably didn't need to say that. She could sense who he was, and he could probably sense her. The tome snapped shut. Her great-grandfather turned it in his hand, gaze tracing over the words on its spine. He turned his head up to look at the walls filled with books on the floors of the atrium above. The knowledge of a country, he murmured. So much, yet so little, and not a word of the truth. Her great-grandfather looked down at her again. Do you come here often, Drawdillon? He asked, to this repository of knowledge. Drawdillon nodded. Why do you come here? To learn, Drawdillon replied. But? I like the stories more. Is that so? He raised an eyebrow. Why do you suppose that is? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her tutors always brought her to the archives to study. Learning how to be a queen was important, but she always thought that there was something much more important. That was why she read so many stories. Except those stories weren't enough. Something was missing, something that words could not convey. At least not in any words that her tutors could understand. Her great-grandfather put the book down on the table beside him. He knelt in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder and looking into her eyes. A slight smile crossed his lips. I suppose that is proof of a sort, he said. Proof of my blood. For I love stories too. Would you like to know the answer, little wormling? The answer to what you feel, what you understand, yet cannot put words to. Drawdillon nodded. Her great-grandfather's smile didn't widen, but she saw it spread to his dark eyes. It is because stories are the most important thing in our world, Drawdillon. Not knowledge, wealth or anything else that will fade with the turning of eons. These books, these records and accounts, they feel empty because they are not the story itself. Her mouth fell open. It was so obvious. Why hadn't she figured it out sooner? Then where are the stories, Papa? Here, her great-grandfather placed a palm on his chest, then placed that palm against hers. And here. They are written in the soul, Drawdillon. Every soul is like a book, its pages empty when a being is born. Those pages are filled with the experiences of one's life, the true stories. At the end of that life, one soul returns to the world. We Dragon Lords are the curators of a vast and ever-expanding library. We exist to protect the world, and our watch is eternal. Drawdillon cast her gaze down at the floor. But I'm not strong enough to protect the world, she said. No single Dragon Lord is strong enough to protect the world. Her great-grandfather's smile tightened. But I suppose you are very fragile as far as Dragon Lords go. But worry not, the world has granted us Dragon Lords a special privilege, one meant to help us perform our duty as its champions. What is it? Drawdillon asked. Primal sorcery, her great-grandfather answered. The magic of the soul. The magic of the world. I believe many mortals refer to it as the magic of dragons. Wild magic. He straightened to his full height and held out his hand to her. Come, little wormling. You have a purpose to fulfill. To fulfill that purpose, there is much you must grasp. An urgent knock roused Drawdillon from her slumber. Your Majesty? Salatia's voice sounded through the door. Your Majesty. Just 5 more minutes, Drawdillon murmured. It's an afternoon, Your Majesty. Draudillen's eyes popped open. She turned her head. Overcast skies lay beyond her window, bright enough to be as late as Salacia claimed. She rolled out of bed, tripping on her white silk nightgown after a single step. BPGPH. Are you all right, Your Majesty? I'm fine. Allahem, we will be right out. Her brow furrowed over the sound of her high-pitched voice. Looking down at her hands and feet, she realized what had happened. Damn it, I used wild magic in my sleep. Walking over to her mirror, she frowned at her reflection. She had become the Draudillen in her dream, an innocent child still filled with wonder over the mysteries of the world. It wouldn't do to walk out of her bedroom looking like a 5-year-old, so she returned to her original self. Salacia lowered her head in greeting, a fluffy white towel in her hands. Good morning, Your Majesty, she said. My most sincere apologies for interrupting your rest. You've been working so hard as of late. No more than anyone else, Draudillen made her way over to the bath. What did we miss? The delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom returned 4 hours ago, Salacia said. We cancelled the morning audiences, so they went out to inspect the city. All of them? Colin usually spends our time in the archives. Yes, Your Majesty. They said they would visit the exclave area before exploring the city and seeing the Merchant Guild. Draudillen's nightwear fell into a puddle at her feet. She went and lowered herself into her steaming bath. A sigh escaped her as she submerged herself up to her shoulders. Colin stopped her research, so does that mean something happened back in the Sorceress Kingdom? If she undertakes a major shift in her strategy. Her court was still reeling from Colin's offensive, so something like that would catch them off balance or even throw them into chaos. It would ultimately depend on what she planned on doing with the Merchant Guild. If she was simply going to forge links with various industries, that was fine, but if the merchants tried to get ahead of the nobility using their new ties, her court would almost certainly see it as yet another front opening up in their battle. Did anyone go along as an escort? Draudillen asked. No, Salacia shook her head. Ever since we started preparing teams for the different cities, things have become impossible to keep up with. We can't spare anyone to keep an eye on them. I can't believe we haven't located a single one of our nobles yet. You don't believe your family would stand up to the beastmen? Salacia sighed, her voice growing forlorn. Yes, Your Majesty, they would. Why must the world be like this? Why must good and brave people perish while unscrupulous and cowardly opportunists are allowed to survive? It all makes it seem like evil is predestined to prevail in the end. It does seem that way, doesn't it? Draudillen stretched with a yawn. That is probably why stories in which good and brave people succeed are all the more compelling. Though their valor is recognized, not everyone can be as they. To be a singular existence that can cleave through the realities that everyone else must wrestle with is not something one sees every day. And those with the power to be those singular existences turn their backs on everyone else in pursuit of selfish ends. Bitterness filled Salacia's voice. Not a single hero has served our kingdom since the beginning of Your Majesty's reign. Oi. That sounds like you're blaming us. My deepest apologies, Your Majesty. Draudillen rolled her eyes. We were just teasing, Salacia. It is doubtful that our existence somehow prevents heroes from appearing. The more likely explanation was that they did have heroes in every generation, but they were killed before they could become strong. No easy way existed to identify that sort of talent. To retain it, a country would have to bind those individuals to them early in their lives. Otherwise, it was likely that they would become full of their own strength and unfettered by nothing but selfish greed and ambition. In a world where power could take or destroy everything without its wielders facing tangible repercussions, it felt like a virtuous hero could only be found in tales. Well, I suppose we have plenty of heroes running around now, undead ones, at any rate. Draudillen rose from her bath and went to change into her outfit for the afternoon. Once that was done, she gave a satisfied nod to her reflection in the dressing mirror. The best part about having Salacia on duty was that, as a follower of the Six, her fashion sense was far more conservative than most. What does our schedule look like for today? There are some sundry matters to address over lunch, Salacia said. The first set of reports from our people in Blighthold have come in and the court would like to review the plans for our restoration efforts. Following that is a tour of the southeastern quarter. The journey to Seagate is tomorrow, so we have some details to go over later this afternoon. We moved the audience with Countess Corlin and her party to this evening after dinner. Barring the tour, it felt like a strangely normal day. A part of her wondered if she was allowed to think that way. How soon before we can visit Blighthold? I believe Anna and the others have devised a way for your visit to come sooner than anticipated. Then it's time for lunch. We are famished. She took a deep breath and settled herself before stepping out of the royal apartments. On the way to the throne room, Sabos stood in his customary place. He reportedly still hadn't eaten or slept since his arrival, so she was starting to feel sorry for him despite his claims that food and bed rest were unnecessary. Sabos greeted him. "We thank you for your hard work." "Your Majesty," the Sorcerer King's butler replied. "Good afternoon. You look especially well rested today." "We feel especially guilty today," Draudillan offered Sabos a self-deprecating smile. "Our people are working so hard. Yet, tell me, Sabos, is this item that allows you to forego rest sold in the Sorceress Kingdom?" "The version of the item that I carry is of limited availability, but other forms may exist. You may want to inquire with the members of Countess Corlin's delegation. They are all merchants with extensive connections. Come to think of it, they never seem tired. Not requiring sleep, is that enviable or pitiable?" As an individual possessed of a draconic bloodline, she leaned towards the latter assessment. Sleep was one of the great joys of life. Captain Scarvo and two of his men saluted as Draudillan and her entourage approached the throne room doors. She resisted the urge to tiptoe to see through the hole that was still there. "Is our court already present, Captain?" "Yes, Your Majesty. The Prime Minister and several members of the cabinet. A few of their aides, as well. There were also probably several nobles working their shifts as members of the palace staff, but that was never mentioned. Servants were supposed to be invisible during official functions, after all." The double doors of the throne room opened and Draudillan made her way in. Conversation hushed and a dozen men and women offered their greetings in unison. "Good afternoon, Your Majesty." "Umu. Good afternoon." She walked into the high hall of the Draconic Kingdom, passing between the lowered heads of her courtiers. After she settled into her throne, Ina's voice carried over the air. "Her Majesty permits you to raise your heads." Draudillan put on a smile as a dozen attentive gazes fixed on her. A table was brought before the throne and lunch was laid out. An unexpected aroma rose from the bowl of oatmeal placed before her. This is richer than expected." She stirred the bowl with a silver spoon. "Are we going through some hidden reserve from our old stores?" Her courtiers remained silent, avoiding her gaze. A few moments later, Sabos spoke from beside her. "The honey and jam are from Corlin County, Your Majesty. The milk and butter are from Gonye Barony. Countess Wagner obtained the cinnamon through her merchant companies that ply the trade cities of the Great Steppe." "Ah, that would explain it." Draudillan's gaze traced over the nobles of her court. They were ashamed that they couldn't provide a meal befitting their queen. At the same time, they were resentful of those who could, especially since they were starting to see them as interlopers. The cinnamon was especially notable, as it was a spice usually reserved for royalty. One might say that the Draconic Kingdom's nobles were being bludgeoned into submission by the sampling of the Sorceress Kingdom's economic reach. Still, what they were doing was rude. She narrowed her eyes at their sullen looks. "Oi, you lot. You cannot be willful brats anymore. Failing to convey gratitude where it is called for is unbecoming of nobles of the Draconic Kingdom and a stain upon our honor." As one, her courtiers paled. Draudillan turned to address Sabos with a warm smile. "Please convey our most heartfelt thanks to Countess Corlin and her party, Sabos. It has been too long since such luxury has graced our table." Sabos lowered his head in silent acknowledgement. Draudillan turned her attention forward again. "So, Lady Yorstin," she said. "What were you discussing just now?" "The reports from our people in Blighthold, Your Majesty," her Prime Minister replied. A mirthless smile formed around the spoon in Draudillan's mouth at Ina's tone. More facts to chafe at her courtier's pride. So much of what they did depended on the generosity of the Sorceress Kingdom. They survived off of their food and supplies. An undead army cleared the land of beastmen. Their transports delivered officials and rapid communication was only possible through them. Her nobles were young, talented and proud. They had come to the palace with bright futures ahead of them and seemingly everything was within their grasp. Now, they felt powerless. More importantly, They felt that they were having their place taken from them. They were not incompetent, but desperation and rashness could result in the same outcomes. She needed to make sure that the pressure that they experienced wasn't so great that they leapt into the void between themselves and their competitors in some monumentally stupid attempt to make up for what they lacked. Of course, understanding what the problem was not the same as solving it. It was a constant battle to keep everything from buckling under the combined strain of their situation, and most of it was out of her direct control. What did they say? The Balak family was more than happy to dump all of the bureaucratic work on our team, Ina reported. Captain Sella is trying to figure out how to effectively deploy the army for policing duties. Captain Insera is on his way back to the city, and Haifat's garrison should arrive late this evening. The staff from the Merchant Guild have gone to attend to their matters. In other words, they were just getting started. Did something happen that necessitates a change in procedure? Our team's report more or less confirms what Lady Zaradnik shared with us, said the Prime Minister. We were discussing how we should go about restoring order. That should be the most straightforward part. Is something getting in the way? The first thing they would need to do was restore the provincial administration. While the loss of nobles was painful, village chiefs were actually the lowest level of management. Even without a presiding noble, they could still report to the nearest urban center, and the administration would continue to function that way. Most villagers likely understood who amongst them was most suited to fill the position. All that the team from the capital needed to do was make it official. Without their queen's blessing, a villager wouldn't dare assume the role. No, Your Majesty, Ina replied. It's more that we believe we have misstepped. Oh? How so? Zaradnik's rapid advance caught us off guard and unprepared. Our initial reaction was to scrape together the bare minimum of what we needed to assume control as quickly as possible. In hindsight, we should have sent as many people as we could afford. Drawdillon nodded. The group that they sent was composed of 4 nobles and 4 clerks from the Merchant Guild. The clerks did not need to leave their assigned city, but the nobles did. 2 of them needed to stay in the city to oversee matters, leaving 2 to go around organizing the villages. It wasn't the best way to go about it, however. The more nobles they sent, the faster the province would get back to its feet. Furthermore, they would gain critical experience relevant to their situation and carry it over to their tasks in the next province. She smiled inwardly as she took a bite out of her buttered toast. She had left them to figure things out on their own, since it wasn't an error that would result in immediate, fatal consequences. They were learning quickly, and they weren't afraid to admit their mistakes and propose corrections. At least to their queen. Can the nobles remaining in the capital handle the increased workload? Drawdillon asked. Yes, Your Majesty, Ina answered. The initial glut of work has already been handled over the past week. Now that we have a good grasp on operations in the capital, we're streamlining processes to better match our capabilities. How many people have you freed up? 130 nobles from the palace staff. The palace and its gardens would fall to dust and disrepair, but she could live with that for now. What about the guilds? Drawdillon asked. We're still awaiting their response, Ina answered. Well, there's no need to wait for them, Drawdillon said. Send whoever is ready on the next transport to Blighthold. The rest can go later. You have all done well. A dozen young faces brightened in response to her praise. Drawdillon's eyes settled on the tall noble standing on the right hand of her courtiers. Zulu, inform Zaradnik about the changes. Imod lowered his head. By Your Majesty's will. So stiff, well, that's to be expected. The son of House Zulu had always carried himself like a martial noble. Though Drawdillon had just ordered the young man to pick up what he could from Zaradnik, that stern demeanor of his had magnified threefold. He hadn't even met with the Baroness yet, as she had been away. His popularity in the court had similarly increased, though much of that was due to Drawdillon's calculations coming together. Marshals held a military office, but they also needed the strength to stand firm against political influence and assert themselves in the court when necessary. Since he didn't go out of his way to make enemies, the young man had many who thought well of him. Unfortunately, they weren't the allies that he needed. Even in the Draconic Kingdom, where external threats were ever present, the relationship between the military and the civilian sectors required constant maintenance. Both were required to maintain a healthy state, yet they tended to drift apart far too easily. Neglecting one seemed to invariably lead to the dysfunction of the other through external and internal issues. She finished off her lunch and settled several small matters before leaving the palace for her scheduled tour of the southeastern quarter. 2 squads of militia led by 2 of her nobles accompanied the 3 carriages of her entourage. Draudilin rode in the central carriage with Ina, Salacia and Sabos, while other members of ministries relevant to the quarter boarded the other vehicles. Citizens called out cheerfully and waved as her procession slowly made its way through the city streets. For the most part, they seemed healthy and energetic, throwing themselves into the capital's recovery efforts. Now that Zaradnik had given the all-clear, the overcrowding receded as refugees were sent to repopulate the lands between Orakalon and Seagate. A distinct cocktail of odors seeped into the cabin after their carriage crossed into the southwestern quarter. In the Draconic Kingdom, the wind either blew in the direction of the sea or away from it, making the southwestern part of Orakalon the location for industries that issued emissions that the citizens found undesirable. Everything from alchemists to tanners made the place their home, though some industries had suffered greater losses than others. They stopped in the largest plaza of the quarter and Sabos left the cabin first to join the inspection of the surroundings. When they deemed the area secure, a footman helped her to disembark. A great cheer arose when her shoes touched cobblestones still damp from the night's rain. Men and women of every vocation in the quarter surrounded the plaza in their occupational garb, giving the reception a distinctly industrial flavor. Her other 3 ladies-in-waiting joined her, though all but Salacia had come in their capacity as ministers. In addition came her ministers of the economy, rural development, and transportation. They followed behind her as she made her way around the plaza, smiling at the crowd and inspecting the goods on display. Tools, tools and more tools, what should I even say? She didn't like making a show of admiring things she had no clue about. She also didn't like wasting other people's time. Something did eventually catch her eye, however. In the center of the plaza, displayed on a modest wooden platform, was a contraption made out of pure steel. This is a plough. Yes, Your Majesty, Mazar Forst, her Minister of Rural Development said. The delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom left it here as a demonstrator. I believe they plan on using it out in the fields at some later date. Isn't this too big to be a plough? That's what everyone says, the minister shrugged. Anything beyond 2 furrows is not economically viable even with a team of draft animals. This plough has blades for 6 furrows. The artisans recognize the high craftsmanship of this tool, but they also dismiss it as practically useless. People with too much money and not enough sense sometimes commissioned ridiculous items of little practical value. Arms and armor that were politely referred to as ceremonial were the most common culprits, though many of the wealthy who fancied themselves akin to the boastful sage came up with all sorts of junk. As shrewd as the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation was, however, she doubted that they would try to foist something useless on the Draconic Kingdom. Several other tools of a similar scale were placed around the plaza. There was a disc harrow, a seed drill, gears for mills that were somehow all fashioned from steel, something labeled as a pump and a steel vehicle frame with different mountings lined up beside it. Are these all employed in the Sorceress Kingdom, Sabos? Draudilin asked. Many tools have been developed over the past year by House Wagner's machining workshops, Sabos said. What you see on display here are those deemed suitable for use in the Draconic Kingdom. The heavy equipment is meant to employ undead labor. Expressions of shock and horror blossomed all around them. Why, Your Majesty, Mazar said. I must respectfully state that there is absolutely no need for the undead in our industries. That's right, Your Majesty, Salacia nodded empathetically. Our country has always managed to bounce back from beastman attacks on its own. The scale is a bit different this time, Draudilin noted. Not only have we lost so many people, but there will be a shortage of draft animals. It's true that those are issues we must face, Salacia said, but we can import draft animals from abroad, yes? The Sorceress Kingdom is undeniably effective when it comes to fighting, but we need not rely on them for anything else. Our people will surely be up to the challenge. Draudilin examined the looks of conviction on the faces of noble and commoner alike. How much of it was pride, how much fear? She was of the mind that too much change at once was not a good thing. Other things did not change as quickly, and the development of a healthy society relied on progress in all of its aspects. Economically speaking, however, not utilizing undead labor was a lost opportunity with so much land to go around. Orban, she said, what do you think? Our ministry does not have enough information to make statements with any confidence, the Minister of the Economy replied. I believe that Countess Wagner has arranged for a demonstration of these farming tools on the journey to Seagate tomorrow. There will be an opportunity to ask for the details then. At least he wasn't adamantly against it. The sheer surplus of certain commodities from the Sorceress Kingdom pointed to how much the Draconic Kingdom stood to gain, but she doubted that undead labor would gain much ground with her subjects so long as there wasn't a need for it. Their tour continued through the southeastern quarter, showing that many of the workshops in the city were already adapting to the realities the rural citizenry would have to face. Nearly every tool was hand-operated and even treadmills were being made. Are there any estimates for local production now that work is underway? She asked. We'll be behind, Your Majesty, Orban said, but not so much that we'll be facing shortages. The tools used around the borderlands are meant just for this situation. Orban gestured to several wagons filled with wheel hoes, a farming tool invented in the Draconic Kingdom. Draft animals and other livestock could not be safely raised on the frontier, so the necessity for farming tools that humans could efficiently use had given rise to the simple device. Wheelhoes were something like a wheelbarrow without the barrow. In its place was a simple frame that could be mounted with various attachments. One could cultivate, furrow, hoe, plow, seed, weed and rake by simply pushing it around. Compared to conventional tools, one could do a day's worth of work in a half hour. Drawdillan could understand how Orban could be so confident about their prospects, as they were not misplaced. She just wished that they wouldn't be so defensive about their position. Do you have anything like that in the Sorceress Kingdom, Sabos? I've never seen the like, Your Majesty, Sabos replied. It appears to be far in advance of the hand tools used in the north. The people surrounding them glowed with pride. Foreigners tended to look down on the Draconic Kingdom due to their situation, so it was a pleasant difference in attitude. Visitors from the theocracy turned up their noses at labor-saving devices, saying that they interfered with the cultivation of strength. Hard work builds character, or so they said. Drawdillan often wondered how they would feel about building character when a pack of hungry beastmen could appear on the horizon at any time. But those days would be behind them soon. At long last, she would be able to draw out the full potential of the Draconic Kingdom, the potential her great-grandfather envisioned when he raised its capital on the shores of the Orichalon. We believe that you may find many other things of interest in our country, Drawdillan beamed. Let's continue, shall we? 17th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 1300 hours. Amodzalu strode through the corridors of Orichalon Palace, a sense of nervousness haunting his steps. Queen Drawdillan had discussed his appointment to the royal court as one of its marshals the previous day, ordering him to learn what he could from Baroness Saradnik. The chief of staff of the Sorceress Kingdom's forces in the Draconic Kingdom had been away for a meeting in her homeland, so today would be his first under her tutelage. The Queen nudged him into meeting with the Baroness by ordering him to deliver the court's newly rendered decision to her. Beyond that, however, he wasn't sure what else he was supposed to be doing. As expected of Her Majesty, she uses everything that can be used, but why did Zaradnik agree to be used? He did not understand a great many things, but obedience was paramount. Understanding would come with time. Zalu. He looked over his shoulder. K.O. I think you grew 5 centimeters overnight, Zoran grinned, slapping Amod on the back. I suppose this is a dream come true, eh? I wouldn't say that. Rather than a dream, Amod felt that he was always meant to join the army. He was a son of Eastwatch, the fortress city that stood at the gates of the Orichalon Reach. The defense of the Draconic Kingdom was his heritage. His father disapproved of his eldest aspiring to a position of command, so he was encouraged to aim for a position in the Queen's household. Instead of challenging his father's wishes, he went along with them, seeing it as an opportunity to learn from the marshals of the royal court. Never in his wildest dreams did he believe that he would be appointed as one 2 years later. Hey now, Zoran said. Half of the guys aiming for the position would kill to be in your shoes. Who else was Her Majesty considering, by the way? Kartol and Yilmaz, I think. I suppose I could see that. There are so many others clamoring for Marshal, though. That there were. Many scions felt that the burden of command in the defense of their homeland was their responsibility, so the tale of fearful fathers sending their precious sons to safety was a common one. Common, too, was the way Amod saw the palace as an opportunity to become familiar with the army. Every one of them knew that there were only two choices for their country: fight or die. No one chose to simply die. No one should be clamoring for martial, Amod told him. Leading militia around is the most any of us has ever done. If it wasn't for the law, I would recommend that the captains of high foot be appointed. I can't say that I find Insera's account entirely believable, Zoran said. If men could become monsters just by fighting endlessly, our country would have an endless number of monsters. Zaradnik said he wasn't wrong. Zaradnik can turn 100 beastmen into paste in the blink of an eye, came Zoran's wry response. She may be overestimating the rest of us humans. There was no point in arguing. Plenty of adventurers thwarted beastman raids in the past, and the strength of the theocracy's forces could not be denied. Despite their grievous losses, the story of Highfoot was an inspiration, proof that the Draconic Kingdom, too, could stand against its ancestral nemesis. All that they needed was a fighting chance. Now, they had it. Hey, where are you going, Zalu? The Sorceress Kingdom's rooms are the other way. I should change into something more suitable. Court fashion is hardly appropriate. But I only ever see Zaradnik in that nice dress of hers? Well, whatever. Let me know how it goes later. Zoran went ahead, waving lazily over his shoulder. Amod returned to his room, opening his dressing cabinet. He sorted through his belongings. The armor he had donned in the defense of the palace had been returned to the palace armory. He had his militia officer's uniform, but that wasn't suitable for his new office. His mind went back to the times he had seen the Queen's marshals around the palace, trying to recall the details of their garb. Amod disrobed, changing into a darker salvar. He stuffed them into his black leather boots. Next came a white shirt and dark sash. He tucked his hauncher in front of his right hip. He reached into the back of the cabinet, taking out his yataghan in its scabbard with its harness. He fastened the harness over his sash, leaving the sword hanging at his right hip. A brown leather vest went over his shirt and leather braces clasped his shirt over his forearms. Last, came a long black robe that hung below the knee. All right. It was probably the best he could do. He didn't have a decent hat. Or a beard. The marshals all had beards. He grabbed the militia spear propped behind his door on the way out. The handful of men and women he passed all stared as he went by. Amod did his best to ignore them. Upon entering the corridor leading to the western end of the palace, he encountered a blonde-haired woman in the garb of a northern maid. Nearby, 4 skeletons were sweeping the floor with brooms. The woman gave his spear the barest of glances and smiled up at him. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked. He frowned inwardly at her reaction. When a 2-meter-tall man dressed in black came down the corridor with a spear, most women would naturally shy away. This one, however, didn't display a shred of fear. A furrow formed on his brow. There was a flanged mace clipped to her waist. Regardless of culture, nearly everyone wore some form of dagger for everyday purposes, but he had never heard of a maid casually wearing a mace. "Are you a spy?" the maid asked. Who in the world would randomly ask that? The skeletons stopped their sweeping to look at him. The maid's smile didn't shift in the slightest. No," he answered. "Amod Zalu, I've come to see the Baroness Zaradnik by Her Majesty's orders." Straw rasping over stone filled the air again. "I see," the maid said. "This way please, Mr. Zalu." Amod warily eyed the skeletons as he passed between them. His steps slowed as they approached a pair of death knights, each guarding the door to the staterooms on either side of the corridor. The maid turned and waited for him in front of the doors. "I pray you to wait here while I inform my lady of your arrival." With that, she entered the room to the left, going straight past the spiky black tower of death without breaking stride. She reappeared a minute later. "The Baroness will see you now." He followed the maid into the stateroom and was led to the suite's hall. The room had been thoroughly rearranged, its rectangular tables combined in the center and laid over with white linen. A mix of living and undead gazes pinned him to the threshold. "Welcome, Your Excellency," Baroness Zaradnik said. "Her Majesty informed me of your appointment. Though our time together may be limited, I hope I can be of some assistance to you." "Thank you for your welcome, Baroness Zaradnik." Amod lowered his head, then stopped. Was he supposed to do that? Though he felt unqualified for the role, he was still a marshal. She was a minor noble, or was she an officer in this case? Either way, a marshal bowed to neither. He cleared his throat. Her Majesty sent me to inform you that more administrative staff will be sent to Blighthold with the next transport. How many? 130, Amod replied. Her Majesty will be using the passenger barge for tomorrow's inspection of Seagate, Lady Zaradnik said, so the first available trip to Blighthold will be tomorrow evening. It takes roughly 12 hours for a barge to travel from Orichalon to Blighthold, but the one we prepared for transporting officials hasn't been furnished with beds for 130. If they don't mind staying awake all night, we can deliver all of them after the inspection returns. Since the wind went inland at night, it was common for ships to make northbound trips at that time. He nodded in response. That shouldn't be a problem, he said. Very well, I'll let Countess Corlin know so she can make the arrangements. Let's see to their security details, shall we? The Baroness beckoned for him to come and join her at the table. He went to stand at the nearest side, glancing at the rows of elder liches to his left and right. Lady Zaradnik stood across from him with one of her half-elf maids. The two children that were rumored to follow her everywhere, even to the battlefield, were there too. He leaned his spear against the table. The maid from before carried it away. For future reference, Lady Zaradnik told him, carrying battlefield weapons around in urban areas for no discernible reason is usually considered a nuisance. His ears colored at her reprimand. He already knew that. Why did he carry a spear with him around the palace? Amod examined the others present at the table. The half-elf maid was in the same type of uniform as the other maid. The boy to her right was wearing a simple pair of pants and an unassuming short-sleeved shirt. The girl had a slightly more fashionable blouse, but it wouldn't be out of place for any village girl to wear vestments of similar quality. All three of them had daggers visible on their person, but nothing else. Lady Zaradnik had no visible armament at all. As Zoran had mentioned, she was dressed in the militant equestrian attire she always appeared in when attending an audience with the Queen. The Baroness examined Amod curiously. He resisted the urge to shift under her scrutiny. I thought the nobles of the Draconic Kingdom were appointed to positions of broad command, she said. We are, he replied. If that's the case, why did you bring a spear with you? He sent a confused look back at Lady Zaradnik. Should a commander not be armed? To clarify, Baroness Zaradnik said, there are normally two types of commanders. Those that lead from the front are categorized as captains. Those who issue orders to armies, usually from positions where they can see what's going on across the battlefield, are categorized as commanders. I assume that, since the Draconic Kingdom appoints nobles as generals and marshals, you would be one of the latter. I don't understand. I read that officers elsewhere start as sergeants and rise through the ranks to become commanders. That's true in other countries with standing armies, she admitted. But it doesn't have to be that way. I thought that the Draconic Kingdom understood this because of the laws they have in place. Captains are drawn from the pool of promising sergeants, who are in turn drawn from the common population. Captains and sergeants are exposed to the greatest risk and would thus require a large pool of candidates to replace them with. Nobles are rare by comparison, so the army would want to keep them relatively safe and give them time to develop. Nobles being commanders follow that line of thought. That was the rationale given, but it generated some resentment. Some saw the appointment of nobles to command positions as undeserved. Amod agreed with that sentiment, but, at the same time, the law must have existed for good reason, else the Queen would have instituted reforms. Then you're saying that I'm doing it wrong? He asked. That I shouldn't be training for personal combat? The answer is complicated, Lady Zaradnik answered. No, the answer is simple, but regional culture has complicated it. Perhaps corrupted is the better term. Somewhere along the way, people started conflating one's role with one's position in the hierarchy. This led to the idea that sergeants become captains, who in turn become commanders. Then those commanders become generals. So, using the simple answer, I should be a captain since I feel that I should stand with my men in battle. Except, I've never heard of a marshal being a captain. They are always generals. Again, that is a part of what I mentioned. Rank is being conflated with role. If you are an excellent captain, you are an excellent captain. It does not make you an excellent general. The Baroness placed a hand on her breast. For instance, I am a captain. I am also the Chief of Staff of the Sorceress Kingdom's forces in the Draconic Kingdom. If it were the Empire, I would be considered a general. The Sorceress Kingdom, however, is not plagued by erroneous cultural distinctions. I am the chief of staff because I hold the highest position of authority. This has nothing to do with my role as captain. I serve as a captain while my commanders serve as commanders. We have generals at home that assist us with strategic planning. Everyone functions in the role that they are best suited for. He wasn't sure if that made sense, but the Sorceress Kingdom was clearly doing something right if it had such spectacular strength at its disposal. Furthermore, Lady Zaradnik said, I think it would be good to have a captain as a marshal. Why is that? Representation. Barriers in the chain of command can blind one to possibilities and avenues of thought. A court full of generals is very far away from the front lines of battle. In the Draconic Kingdom, this is exacerbated by the fact that nobles can be distant from the common folk and everything in your country is rigid out of necessity. Was that how other countries saw them? He supposed that was probably the case. In the Draconic Kingdom, processes were optimized to keep the country from falling behind in the endless cycle of raids and predation. Excessive deliberations, insubordination and decisions that wasted resources would invariably get everyone killed. Then I will aim to be a captain, Amod said. I've always felt that is what I should be. In that case, Lady Zaradnik said, I will do my best to guide your excellency along that path. A word of caution, however. He looked up with a question on his face. Captains must be strong, the Baroness told him. A relatively weak commander can manage with strong captains under them, but it doesn't work the other way around. Just as a sergeant is the pillar of a squad, a captain is the pillar of a company. If a company shatters because that pillar is weak, it is a great deal of trouble for a commander. I understand. Your Excellency does not, Lady Zaradnik smirked. But you will, eventually. Now, let's see to what Her Majesty sent you over for, shall we? The royal court insists on keeping most of its domestic matters to itself, but we can't have that here. We need to know how Her Majesty plans to deploy her officials and what sort of schedule they'll be keeping. Amod looked down at the map on the table. He tried to keep his eyes from wandering between all the markers as he focused on the northwestern corner. Originally, he said, the royal court planned on sending 4 nobles to Blighthold along with 4 clerks from the Merchant Guild. 2 of the nobles would be based in the city and the other 2 would be stationed in each of the towns in the province. The province is small, only about 3,000 square kilometers. Each village tends to roughly 10 square kilometers of land each. There are 300 villages north of Blighthold, plus the city and the 2 towns. And Highfoot. The sheer number of villages and their size in the Draconic Kingdom is still something I can't get used to. Your lands must be astonishingly productive. Shouldn't it be the same in the north? Amod asked. The population of Riestais is over 9 million and the Baharuth Empire is not far behind. You're right, the Baroness answered. I haven't been to the heartlands of Riestais, but villages in the Empire do manage about the same amount of land as you mentioned. The Duchy of Irantal has a lot of frontier and my territory is still mostly undeveloped. Lady Zaradnik cleared her throat and focused on the map again. So Her Majesty is deploying 130 nobles to expedite reorganization and give them practical experience? After that, who will be left behind to manage things, Your Excellency? I'm afraid I know little about how the Draconic Kingdom's provincial administration works. His thoughts went back to his lessons as a child, most of which had to do with memorizing the country's political and economic processes. The Draconic Kingdom was highly regimented due to the realities of living with beastmen neighbors. From what he knew of the highly stable northern nations, the Baroness would likely be unfamiliar with several key points. Unlike the cities of the northern countries, Amod said, every city in the Draconic Kingdom is a free city under the Crown. Each is managed by administrative staff appointed to it by Her Majesty. The number depends on the size and population of the province, but, in our current situation, it would be the 4 originally assigned to the city. What about the rest of the province? Each barony has 5 villages. Each county is composed of 5 baronies, one of which is directly managed by the count. The counts live in the towns and cities, or at least they used to. 2 counts had manors in Blighthold while there were 5 counts in each of the towns. Also, the General of Highfoot serves both as the garrison's chief of staff and as the lord of the fortress and its territories. In hindsight, sending 4 nobles to do the work of 60 was insane. The ones they had sent to Blighthold would probably be weeping in relief when the others arrived. So in all, Lady Zaradnik tapped her chin lightly with her index finger, there are 12 counts, 48 barons and 1 military governor. The fact that they must also serve as military governors makes it essential for commanders to be appointed from the nobility. What about the city's administrative staff? Spares from the local houses, Amod replied. And the household staff of each noble? Senior household staff are the spares of other houses. Junior staff are usually commoners or senior staff for the next generation. The tapping finger stopped. A furrow appeared on the Baroness' brow. How many siblings do you have? 3 brothers and 5 sisters. Is that normal for families in the Draconic Kingdom? Lady Zaradnik asked. For noble families, yes, Amod nodded. Rural families usually have around 4 to 6 children, depending where they are. That would be a nightmare in the north, the Baroness said. People would be constantly feuding over inheritance. The beastmen are constantly eating us, so. That's right, isn't it? I apologize, Your Excellency, I was thinking of things in terms customary to the north. Up there, families, regardless of social strata, only have as many children as they require to inherit. It's usually the eldest son, the backup son, and the rest are undesirable extras. If we only did that much, Amod said, we'd be rapidly eaten out of existence. Redundancy after redundancy after redundancy, Lady Zaradnik murmured. Everyone has a large family because you expect to be eaten at some point. Nobles scatter their signs everywhere as reserve administrators to replace inevitable losses. Commanders are nobles because martial nobles are natural commanders and can be quickly replaced from that reserve, plus they possess the skills necessary to serve as governors. The free cities serve as hubs from which recovery can be rapidly facilitated. Lines of authority are all within 1 or 2 steps of the Queen. The Draconic Kingdom is full of survival mechanisms evolved from its relationship with the Beastman country. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a good thing, Your Excellency. I've seen what happens when the opposite is true, when countries are allowed to ignore the realities of the world. The problem is that the Draconic Kingdom may follow in the footsteps of one of those countries soon. What do you mean by that? Amod asked. When security is treated as a given, other problems may rise to the fore. Complacency, decadence, internal strife and corruption. Priorities shift and society decays because people are allowed to rest on their laurels. I can only pray that Queen Auriculus is capable of leading your country through those problems. Lady Zaradnik drew up missives for the captains of the Highfort garrison, detailing the security needs of the nobles who would arrive at Blighthold. After that, her attention went across the Sealand River. We're going to need to perform extra sweeps. I think so too, Captain, the half-elf maid said. Does that mean Blighthold isn't safe? Amod frowned. Our advance up until the Sealand River was very thorough about ensuring the lands were clear, Your Excellency, Lady Zaradnik replied. The problem is that the beastmen across the Sealand chose to flee rather than fight. We had to rush ahead and get rid of them before they started overrunning villages in their flight. Amod examined the familiar map filled with unfamiliar markers. There was a front line advancing steadily southeast, which he assumed were the Sorceress Kingdom's forces. Ahead of them were a few scattered markers up to the River Oars. You've retaken Orsford, his gaze fixed on the fortress east of Highfort. How many men did you find there? I'm sorry, Your Excellency, the Baroness said. Orsford was empty when we arrived. The Beastmen tribes in the vicinity appear to have long moved on. He quietly nodded. The court was hoping for another miracle akin to Highfort, but it was an unrealistic expectation. His eyes followed the river to its estuary. What is all this at Orsport? The beastmen are struggling to cross the river, Lady Zaradnik said. Word of the undead reached the clanholds there through beastmen fleeing down the coastal highway, but the river is 2 kilometers wide at its mouth. The ferry can only get so many across at a time, and the river doesn't narrow to a more reasonable width until one journeys 30 kilometers inland. Baroness Zaradnik took the thin rod and pointed at the area across the river. A number of large markers were clustered near the city of Helama. My general staff believes that the beastmen are preparing to make their stand here, she said. At least the beastmen in the provinces surrounding the city. If we don't press the issue, they'll have consolidated their numbers in roughly a week. How many beastmen are there? Current estimates place their numbers between 70 and 80,000. Amod swallowed. That was twice as many beastmen as had laid siege to the capital. Can you win? It's not so much whether we can win or not, but the manner in which we win. I was hoping I could lean on any knowledge you have of past battles in and around your cities before we settle on our battle plan. Lady Zaradnik nodded to one of the elder liches. The undead mage produced a map and unfurled it over a free section of the table. The elder liches nearby took a step back and floated into the air as Lady Zaradnik and the other living members of her staff went to stand over the map. Amod went over as well, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of the elder liches looking down from above. The map portrayed the city of Helama, though it didn't look like a map from the palace archives. He frowned at the level of detail, which included labels for the different quarters, important buildings, the names of the streets and even notes on the city's fortifications. "Where is this map from?" he asked. "I made it this morning, Your Excellency," Lady Zaradnik answered. "Since the audience with Her Majesty was cancelled, I took the opportunity to fly over and take a look at what was going on." The elder liches added labels for the features by cross-referencing maps of the city from the archives. Several questions over national security rose in his mind over her claim. A large part of a defender's advantages lay in attacking parties' unfamiliarity with the land. In a single morning, Lady Zaradnik had simply flown over and created a map of one of their major cities. Presumably, anyone with access to flight magic or flying mounts would be able to do this, yet he had never heard or read of any army doing so. "Is reconnaissance like this common?" Amod asked. "I know that the Baharuf Empire does this, at least," the Baroness replied. "We've been unchallenged in the air over the Draconic Kingdom thus far, so we are assuming that the Beastman invaders are unaware of this capability. What they appear to know about what's going on and how they react to it is consistent with the idea that they aren't employing any divination magic or aerial assets." "If you already know so much," he said, "what do you need from me?" "First would be any clues as to how Helama will react to the build-up of beastmen. There were 3 clan holds around the city before our arrival. Right now, it looks like those beastmen are moving to occupy the city. We would like to get rid of all these clans at once, but we also need to consider the well-being of the citizens. I thought you told the Queen that the idea that your army is an undead horde makes it so that the beastmen don't retaliate by attacking the citizens." "It does," Lady Zaradnik told him. "The problem is that 60,000 beastmen in one place means that a lot of humans are going to be eaten in that one place. We've been harrying them so that they can't hunt properly, but they'll have the opportunity to when they gather around Helama. One of the generals back in the Sorceress Kingdom suggests that it may become a double siege." "A double siege?" The rationale uses the invaders' observed behaviors so far. Helama and its surrounding provinces have been claimed by these 3 clans. There are an additional 3 clans worth of beastmen coming in, threatening their already limited food supply. To defend that food supply, the general proposes that the host clan holds will move into the city and bar the gates. The towns and villages in the area will also see the same actions taken, but those settlements don't have the same defenses as a city. So one set of beastmen will be acting to defend humans from being eaten by other beastmen so they can eat them later? A slight smile crossed the Baroness' features. "I admit that it sounds strange, but if you categorize humans as livestock it becomes one party protecting their property from another. Much like how humans might protect their livestock against demi-human raiders. Does that mean they'll start to fight one another over resources?" "I don't know," Lady Zaradnik replied. "A part of the reason why we're allowing them to gather like this is to find out. This entire campaign so far hasn't been about winning or losing. It's been about testing the physical, mental and societal limits of the species of beastmen occupying the Draconic Kingdom. Now, we want to find where the line between order and chaos resides." Amod looked back down at the map again. Dozens of settlements would be exposed to the experiment that Baroness Zaradnik was conducting. Considering that the Draconic Kingdom had been helpless to begin with, however, he knew he had no right to protest. "Your forces are so powerful that none of this is required," he said. "Why not crush them and be done with it? Thousands of men, women and children will die while you collect the information that you desire." "Because we can't." He frowned at the noblewoman's response. "You can't? Did you not kill 40,000 beastmen in a matter of hours with a single infantry company when you arrived in the capital?" "I did," Lady Zaradnik said, "but the circumstances are not the same. The Battle of Orichalon consisted of securing the city's gates and destroying the beastmen trapped inside the city's walls. Here, we'll have 80,000 beastmen scattered around the exterior of Helama. To crush them, not simply scatter them, We need to position our forces to keep them from escaping. That deployment takes time, so we are making the best use of that time. The Baroness took her pointer and reached over to indicate the provinces north of Oraculon. Tonight, we'll be mobilizing the infantry company that has been stationed around the capital since we arrived. That includes the tens of thousands of undead created out of the capital's invaders. One of the cavalry squads will join them, as well. They'll be destroying every beastman tribe up to 50 kilometers north of the Oraculon River. At the same time, they will encircle the beastmen south of Halama and push them towards the city. The way you say it, a trace of anger rose in his voice. This could have been done at any time. We could have attacked them at any time, yes, Lady Zaradnik said. But, as with everything, we must consider the bigger picture. In the beginning, we knew nearly nothing about these beastmen. We still know comparatively little. Going in headfirst entailed too many unknown risks, both to your citizens and the long-term outlook of the campaign. Now, we are in a position to be aggressive because we've discerned what risks appear to be non-existent and have mostly neutralized the rest. Despite her rationale, it still felt wrong. She had the strength to act immediately, but instead chose to study her target like a predator stalking their prey. In that time, tens of thousands of the Draconic Kingdom's citizens had probably been eaten. What about Halama? He asked. If 3 Beastman clans shut themselves in with the citizens, the population will be decimated in no time. 3 whole clans was around 30,000 Beastmen. If each ate 1 human every 2 weeks, the time that the battle and its preparations would take would see most of the city consumed. It will take time for those clans to arrive in the city, the Baroness said, so it won't happen as quickly as you think. Volunteers from the Balik family, as well as local collaborators in Halama, will be helping to preempt that. Additionally, we'll be bringing in some of our own specialists as insurance.